We are broadcasting from our professional studio. We should mention, however, that yesterday we had fantastic news that BI campus is reopening, so we look forward to welcoming you back to our main facilities soon. Our distinguished guest today is Trond Morten Lindberg, who is CEO for BDO, Europe, Middle East and Africa. He is a BI alumni, and he's currently overseeing growth and development strategy of BDO in 97 countries across 3 continents, taking a variety of cultures into account. He also leads BDO International Global Innovation Stream and sponsors the Sustainability Initiative. And rumor says it that before this international crisis emerged, he was more frequently sleeping on airplanes than in his own bed due to extensive travel. We will soon hear his perspectives on the current situation, but I would also then like to introduce the other 2 panelists. We have Professors Espen Henriksen and Professors Torger Reve from BI Norwegian Business School, who will provide comments from the academical side of the equation. Let's start with the current state of the economy, because we have all seen and felt the economic contraction following the COVID pandemic. Wednesday, a week ago, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, the OECD, released the organization's twice-a-year economic outlook. They project that GDP will decline by 9% in the euro area and 7% in the United States. At the same time, broad stock market indices, such as the S&P 500, is at the same level as the index was 6 months ago. One explanation for the apparent conundrum is that the stock market predicts a sharp V-shaped recovery. Trond Morten, you are working closely with some of the largest and most successful corporations in Europe, Middle East and Africa, with people who don't only know BDO, but also global businesses. What are your thoughts on the recovery?
That's a big question. First of all, Anders, thank you for being here. It's a pleasure. Kind of starting that discussion, I think, COVID today would be a huge uncertainty, especially throughout Europe. I think one of the most interesting things we kind of are observing would be, the uncertainty kind of stretching in time. So when we looked into our clients predominantly in April, they kind of thought, well, this is going to be difficult throughout 2020. While on the other hand, when we did the same research in May, and the results are quite fresh, obviously, people think it will last longer, right? So I think one word for Europe would be uncertainty. Yes, there are predictions on a decreasing GDP and so on throughout Europe, but no one actually know what will happen. It's interesting to see, the first couple of months into the pandemic, most actions taken has really been around preserving cash within the business. I think something like 3/4 of UK businesses today are saying that, well, we have cash reserves for 6 months. So the transition from, a stimulated economy from government stimulus and grants into kind of running a business as normal sometime during the fall would be tremendously interesting to follow. And then again, the uncertainty kind of spreads because about two-thirds of the job cuts done will probably not be replaced, right? So that's just interesting to see.
Espen, would you like to comment?
Could I actually ask a question just to Trond Morten? So
please go
when you
ahead.
say that like 2/3 of the job cuts are not going to replace, so 2/3 of the job losses we are observing, you believe are going to be permanent, or these are people who will have to find a new job, not coming back to their all job when this pandemic is over?
Yeah, no, so I'm basically referring to you know, what the mid markets out there say, and they have been creating a lot of jobs, obviously, during the past 12 to 24 months, and what they're saying right now is it's a big uncertainty to the fact the jobs will ever come back, right? Okay. Yeah. Which then again creates uncertainty amongst, you know, staff, employees all around.
Because I would like to comment on
sort
of this apparent disconnect between the markets and the real economy. Because as Anders was saying initially, sort of these OECD projections, sharp decline in GDP. As Trond Morten is saying, this is actually really affecting the mid-market. Because the big question that the economists have been asking is the economy a steak or a grape? In the sense that we have to put the economy in a freezer for a little while during the pandemic, and if we put a steak in the freezer and we refreeze it, it's almost as good as before. If we put a grape in the freezer, it's totally useless. So it's somehow, how are we going to emerge? This is the big question. And then what Trond Morten is saying about the huge unemployment that is going to probably stick, then it makes it even more puzzling that we're seeing this disconnect between the markets and the... so it's essentially that the economy is more of a grape than a stick.
Torger, what's your take on this and this grape versus steak and the you know, a bit dark predictions of all these potential jobs that will simply vanish?
Well, I'm not quite sure it will be as bad as that. I think what we'll see is that there's a big difference between industries. If you're in tourism or airlines, you know, clearly there will be a large decline, but many other industries are actually doing okay. Look at retailing, some of that, and electronic trade and so on. It's booming. So there may be the end results we don't really know yet. I'm not studying this at the economy level. I'm studying it from the business level, and we see lots of business actually now into an innovation phase where they really looking for new things, and it's really interesting to see what will come out at the end, because this is perhaps the largest shock that business has been through since Second World War, and that we haven't really no experience and see what will happen.
So one thing is different businesses, but there are probably also differences between different regions in Europe and also different regions of the world.
Absolutely. So and you said in your introduction, I'm basically overseeing Europe, Middle East, and Africa, right? So let me try to comment on Middle East and Africa as well. And Middle East, as we did, obviously, you know, experienced a double dip due to the decline in oil prices and so on. And I'm not following it that close, right? But I think it's quite interesting to see what the 6 GCC countries are doing, and I think they will develop quite differently going forward as well. Some being small populated countries, high income per capita, large reserves, they will probably do quite well. Some others are different, and I think, you know, the cuts in government spend will be huge, and potentially introduction of taxes, which we didn't see to a large extent in the region, will affect the economy as well going forward. So that's kind of, it's uncertain. They obviously got hit hard, and it's going to be interesting to follow. And let me comment just briefly on Africa.
Please.
They're to some extent a bit behind. I guess, and this would be my personal comment, we could probably question, you know, the COVID numbers coming out of Africa or the African continent right now. But they're somewhat behind due in time as well. It's very interesting to look at South Africa to me, because it's kind of a close to European economies in some sense, very far in some others, right? So, but the interesting thing is their ability to kind of stay resilient throughout this period is at a total different level than, you know, what we experience on an average basis in Europe. They have been through, you know, large corruption scandals. Their currency was weakened quite a lot, you know, the last couple of years. They have the black empowered economy, which is affecting businesses in general, and they have dealt with this stuff, you know, in the way they needed to deal with it the past couple of years. So COVID would, to some extent, be just another thing coming in, which we need to deal with as well, right? So their ability to look offensively into the future is, to me, quite impressive, right? And there's a lot to learn from a European average firm looking into South Africa these days.
They have this like inherent change readiness, so it's
exactly.
Yeah.
And so I think South Africa, Hong Kong, you know, and a couple of others in Asia as well, are basically going through periods of time where they need to be constantly resilient, right? And most European countries didn't experience that so far.
Torger?
Well, I can say a lot about Africa. I'm a big fan of Africa. I think the growth will come there after we've seen this huge growth in Asia. I'm more concerned about Europe, because Europe, in a way, is losing out in many industries. And if we take one discussion about Norway, as we are based here, it's not perhaps the COVID itself. It's perhaps what's happening in the oil and gas industry what really impacts us most. Because if we know there is that industry will eventually have a decline, but if we get a low oil price, as we saw during this crisis, this would have the biggest impact on Norway. And because this is really the large technology industry, the large base for the Norwegian wealth. So that is the big change that will lead to lots of innovation and decline. I mean, that will really affect the coast especially. And I'm sure it will have macroeconomic effects as well. It will go back to what happens to taxes and all that sort of stuff. So we have two crises right now here.
Yes. We actually have a question that came from our listeners. Thank you for being so active. And it's kind of a huge question as well, but I'd like to see your take on this. The question is, what will be the best opportunities in the future, both for industry and for leadership? And I guess we could spend the rest of the seminar reflecting on that. We could try to narrow it perhaps down to industry in a sense, and we'll get a little bit back to leadership a little bit later on. Where do you see sort of the best opportunities in the future, based on your current level and ability to predict?
I was kind of hoping you passed that question on, Anders, but no. So it's a big one, right? So where do you see the best opportunities in the future in terms of industry? It's apparent that some industries these days are really been hit hard, right? So I think this burst is basically, you know, a personal choice as well. What do you want to do, right? So do you want to jump into something pretty safe, where you probably not get that hard hit, right? Or do you actually want to jump into, from a leadership perspective, into an industry that's hit hard right now, that's probably going to be down for 3 to 5 years, and then have the opportunity to kind of you know, contribute to the rise of that industry, right? Yeah. So I don't think there's one answer to the question. I think you know, you need to go where the opportunities are. That would be my choice. Yeah. Probably strange to say when you work within audit and accounting, right? But that would be my choice. Some others might, you know, cleverly choose something else. Yeah.
Torger, do you want to comment?
Yes, you could perhaps, of course, say health right now, because this is obvious one area where there'll be more resources devoted. But on a more general note, I would say you would have to look for the opportunities based on what your strengths are. And it has to do with where you have a strong knowledge base, where you have a strong technology base. And I think we should add where it's also a sustainable industry, because some of the old industries don't really meet the sustainability requirements. And if you can combine that, and we see some of that movement in all parts of the world with green energy and so on, where I think there are lots of opportunities.
Espen, do you want to?
I don't know whether I have much to add, but I think the key question would also be partly sort of trying to distinguish what is temporary and what is structural. So you're all guys, when Trond Morten is talking about the Gulf states, Torger is talking about Norway, that, for example, lower oil prices is structural. And this is probably, economically speaking, a much bigger deal for Norway than COVID-19 in isolation. And then I think you can sort of think about the same thing in terms of different industries. What is structural, what is going to change for the long run, and what is just going to, as soon as we get this pandemic under control.
Yeah, I believe I saw this picture, I think it was in The Economist, where there is like 3 tsunamis coming. So one is the COVID, the second is the oil price, and then the third is the climate change. And the waves just keep getting bigger. So it looks like we're in for dire straits. I think that we could move on to a theme that is highly relevant these days. It's digital acceleration versus gain from co-location. So COVID-19 has overnight sort of led us into this digitized work mode. The daily work routines were suddenly mostly conducted from home. Trond, Morten, in your sort of experience now, having been part of this abrupt journey for the last month, do you think that this line of work will continue and evolve further once a vaccine or a medical treatment is available? Or will we go back to our work routines and our business the way it was previous to March 2020?
A good question, a very good question, and so we actually asked that question to a few European businesses throughout the survey we just did. I got the numbers yesterday on a preliminary basis, and the respondents are basically saying that, well, 1/3 are going back to the same level of working from home as they were pre-COVID, and 2/3 say they will increase the opportunity working from home, right? I guess when we started or jumped into this phase, we basically experienced that, well, on a personal note, that stuff we have been pushing our people to kind of implement over a period of 2 to 3 years, with some resistance from partners and staff all around, right? All of a sudden happened in a split of a second. So we do actually have the ability to adopt when we need to adopt. On a personal note, I was kind of put on the ground. I've been on the ground for 3.5 months, which has been nice. And the big question would be, would I go back to travel as much as I did sometime during the fall of next year? And I would probably need to go back traveling, right? Maybe we could reduce it. But the big thing, and I've experienced basically following up a lot of our leaders around the countries I'm responsible for the last 3 months, and where you have a solid personal relation, you could obviously do that over Teams within an hour or something like that. Where you don't have that solid relation, it's very difficult, right? It's very challenging to actually get something from that conversation during the course of an hour's call. So I still think those personal relations would be incredibly important. I still think we need to travel. Yes, we might, work more from home and so on and so forth. But I think we'll go back to something that is a situation where we still will appreciate the fact where we meet people, right? And we just had some people moving into our headquarters in Brussels a couple of weeks back. And interestingly, they say, it's so lovely to be back, right? It's so lovely to be back, just sharing a chat around the coffee machine, and so on. So I think we're all kind of looking forward to coming back to some sort of a new normal as well.
The fundamentals of what they refer to as digital leadership, in a sense, is the same principles, is the same as being physically present, being a leader. But they emphasize the importance of working hard to build relations, because it's more challenging over a not as rich format. And the secondly is that having a shared conception of reality, reducing uncertainty and misconceptions, is even more important. Simply because it's much easier to do that when you're physically co-located in the same place. Absolutely,
and you can sense so much more when you actually sit in the same room as someone.
You can. Torger, you mentioned something before we started the day that was a bit more profound and concerning about what we have discovered during this crisis, when suddenly our supply chains have actually been found to be a bit disturbing. Could you please elaborate a bit on that?
Yes, because what happened was we have been having an international way of setting up the value chains, supply chains. We can source from everywhere, and suddenly we are able to source. I mean, in the health sector, we didn't have any of the protective equipment because it was all made in China, and suddenly the supply chains broke down. And this, of course, been based on division of labor. All we did teaching globalization and so on. So I think globalization, in a way, will get a setback. You can't run a country without having. I mean, there's too much risk of getting all your supplies from uncertain sources. So suddenly, maybe we'll have to go back to manufacture things in Europe, which is we have forgot about because we outsourced manufacturing to Asia. And that's a profound change. And actually, digitalization made it possible to source from everywhere. A very fancy system, just-in-time delivery, and suddenly there was nothing. And we saw that influence health. That will influence other industries as well. Now many industries here in Norway are not getting started because supply chains are not in order.
Let me put some numbers to it. So, so half of the respondents in our survey basically said that our supply chain was not as robust as we expected coming into COVID, and 4 out of 10 experienced one of their providers or suppliers ceasing during COVID. Right. So I think you're exactly right. I think what we will see is, you know, a rebuild, a rethink of the value chains and the supply chains, and I think those will be more local, more domestic, or more regional at least. Right.
Could I just ask a question to these two other distinguished guys? So, because one is to then source more domestically, but the other thing could be to just make things more robust. I mean, there's more degrees of freedom. So, what do you guys see? And this is sort of a question I've been sort of wrestling, or at least been curious about myself. That will you just sort of do things not so much time, just in time, just have a little bit more delays, a little bit more building for inventory, which could sort of, make things more robust?
It could, but I'm not sure if they have time.
No, okay.
And I'm not sure if the markets would have time. I'm not sure if they have cash. So it's basically builds. It requires you to build a different cash balance as well, right? So I would kind of think that that would be challenging.
But if you run a hospital, you can't sort of wait for the supplies to come in. I mean, you need them immediately.
Exactly.
And this sort of risk factors that we didn't think they were real, because we analyzed risk and we never thought of the pandemic as a real risk. We talked about that something will never happen, but then it happened, and then we see our model that we have been teaching. And industry's been, it's really economic to do it the way we did it. We can't run it like that. And I think this will be a profound change. And we need to find new ways of setting up supplies, especially in the critical industries, like health.
And I think as well, the big thing to me is basically when we do this rethink of the supply chains, trust will come in as an incredibly important factor. And then again, what do you trust most, right? Would that be something you actually nearly control, quite close to your own origin? Or would that be something in, whatever other continent, right? And I think the answer to that is quite clear.
And history should, keep us reminded that it happens now, but it has happened before, and it will probably happen again. We're sitting in the studio, and just outside the other side of the street, there's a huge wall, which used to be around a hospital, which was meant for quarantine, to keep sick people in the hospital and to keep sort of the healthy people not getting sick. This leads us over to sort of the theme, which we have touched upon already. We are talking about how we can move forward into a more sustainable direction when it comes to how we run our business. Because several influential commentators are suggesting that our pandemic response was a disaster, and we can't afford to make the same mistake when it comes to handling climate change. And it has been voiced quite strongly that the way forward would be to go through what we refer to as sustainable business development. So Morten, for those of our listeners who are not that familiar with the topic, could you please sort of spell it out for us? What would then sustainable business development be in a nutshell?
Yeah, and there will be a lot of definitions of, you know, what a sustainable business is, right? But let me start by saying, well, we're living in a world, and we touched on that already, which is incredibly complex, right? From a religion perspective, from a cultural perspective, geopolitics these days is challenging, let's put it that way, and it will be going forward as well. In terms of sustainability, there is a common language around it, right? So I'm often, you know, jumping down to the UN Sustainability Development Goals, which is a common language endorsed by close to 200 political leaders, and a common language the businesses of this world might need today as well to cooperate and make, you know, growth happen going forward. It's a huge combination of societal, environmental, and economic goals. And the most important thing to me in terms of sustainability would not necessarily be to, you know, cover up all of these aspects. But I would really, and I'm really advising the people I meet to, well, you know, use it as a framework. Tick the boxes for compliance purposes from the start. See where you are. Set yourself some, you know, put some goals up there and be tough enough to measure and make those measures public. And then pick an area where you can find some passion yourself, and or within the team or within the industry. So pick an area or two, and you know, try to really create competitive advantage over time. So that would be my sense. Is this, you know, widely accepted amongst businesses all around the world today? No, I don't think it is. But I think it's a huge opportunity going forward for most businesses.
Thank you. Torger?
Well, I agree with that. I think this will be the large movement that we now see in industry around the world. But the problem is, how can we meet this? And I think governments are now spending tremendous amounts of money to fix the crisis. They think they're going to fix the crisis. I mean, that type of money, that enormous amount, should also be focused on sustainability. There's a chance now that many of the things that governments are implementing are actually protecting all industries rather than going and do this change. So if we could combine that money and tell the business that receive money from government and other kind of regulations that should be going for the green transformation. Otherwise, we will have to do it again, and I don't think we have the resources to really do it. So be careful about what governments are doing right now.
Yeah, but I mean, critical voices would say that the problems that we are facing now with climate change was caused by business in the first place. So how can we trust now that this initiative is not just another example of, you know, greenwashing or window dressing? Espen, how can we ensure that this is not just sort of a, you know, something they do like a patenting?
Sure. Yeah. I think it's a little bit too narrow to put all the blame on businesses. I think it's important that we sort of understand the structure of the problem, in the sense that climate change is probably the biggest tragedy of the commons problem we all are facing. And by that I mean that if I, for example, stop all my CO2 emissions, that would be a huge cost for me, but it wouldn't help a thing for climate change. So there's somehow this, that the marginal gains and the marginal costs for every one of us is totally screwed. So we need common action, and that's sort of, that the pandemic has shown that we may actually be getting together and solve problems globally or together. So that's promising. Then I also want to comment on the problem then with government actions these days. So what we didn't really touch upon when we talked initially, but that is how much money governments have spent on fighting COVID-19. So take, for example, the US government. The US government is now, after this, more indebted than they've been any time since 1945. So the money they need to spend defeating both Germany and Japan at the same time. That means that the fiscal room today to actually do something about or government action is very limited. So that's actually the businesses need to do something. We can't just wait for. But then it's somehow, I'm more of the kind of cynical guy, or not cynical, but I don't believe business owners are doing something just for the common good. It has to be somehow affect the bottom line. And then, so this is the big challenge, sort of how to align incentives, how to solve the problem.
Yeah, and I would totally agree to that. The interesting thing, the interesting thing is actually when you talk to young talents out there, right? So, do they care about sustainability in terms of choosing their first employer or second employer? Well, they do, right? So I think 2/3 of European employers basically said that, well, we expect the firm we work for to take an active or have an active policy in terms of, you know, how they can contribute to sustainability. And these are, you know, they're young guys today, but they will be the leaders of tomorrow, right? So it'll affect the firm you work in, and it will affect the markets in terms of establishing a peer-to-peer pressure, in terms of choosing your suppliers and vendors, right? So maybe that's a big hope, but I certainly think that will happen over time.
Okay.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think the young generation moving into business now, they will put demands on business, and that will be one change factor. But I think the other change factor, and I go back to Espen, who was in finance, is when investors also start to behave in that way and saying, okay, those businesses with young people like to work for that are more sustainable than others is perhaps a better investment object. And so if we can get those two forces working, and government not interfering with that by putting money on the wrong things, I think we have a chance to get further on the sustainability agenda.
Great. Espen?
I'm a little bit just to be a little bit cynical.
Now I was getting optimistic.
Yeah, no, fine.
Finance people always
no, exactly. But one benefit of, for example, the UN development goals is that they're so wide and they cover so many areas that almost any business can say they're compliant with at least a few of them, and they can spin a story, being just violating a few other ones grossly, but you can still be with the UN development goals and go with that pin. So what I'm really curious about, and so sort of we have heard Trond Morten is talking about, it's sort of how to make it into something material, something that is just not marketing. Yeah.
I think that's is a very good comment, Espen. And you know, so far we have seen a lot of businesses basically not doing so much, but still putting up a chapter or a paragraph or a few paragraphs in the annual reports, right? So it's, you know, it paints a glossy picture of sustainability in the business, and that actually was probably enough, and it might be enough today as well. My point would be that, you know, that's not enough going forward. People will kind of look through that and ask for the real actions. They will ask, where were you last year in terms of this and that, and where are you now, and what's your ambition into next year? And just remember, so it's, you know, diversity and inclusion would be a part of the whole sustainability agenda, right? And I think if we go back, and you know, read this through media, a big bank in the Nordics basically went out to their lawyers saying, well, when you participate in this tender, you need to show us what's your gender equality policy, what has been so far, what's the status now, and what's your ambitions for the future. And that was one of the criterions they basically were choosing their lawyers on, right? Some went out, and some went in as new suppliers for that bank. So it is to some extent happening as well.
One sort of final reflection before we go to the last theme of our panel. So one of the listeners has asked, Has COVID changed sort of the way we work completely, or has it simply added to speeding up change along a path that we have already started? And I should add, do you see that path as beneficial for also handling climate change?
Ooh. Yes, I obviously think it, it put more pace into changing the way we work. It did. Short term, obviously, it affected climate change because people didn't travel. They kind of operated in a different way. It's still a big question whether that's sustainable or not. Yeah, I think it basically made more speed behind whatever transformation we're talking about, and people actually saw that, well, we can actually make this happen, right? So I think that's interesting.
Thank you.
It has changed something, but I mean, actually, it speeded up the transformation. I think that was the good thing about it. We learned much faster than we would otherwise do. But I don't think it will change fundamentally the way we work. Maybe with some exceptions. I've seen now teams, and you probably have that in your organization, which are very international, and you can do it without traveling. I mean, you know a way of working now, so they can people around the world in knowledge industries. That is very interesting. You can do innovation long distance in a way. So I think there are certain things, and we make sure we don't lose that, because this learning has been going very fast. I think we could also comment on how universities and business schools have been learning and transforming its things very fast. We didn't think they were usually very slow, and suddenly they had to change, and they did it.
Yeah. And when you mentioned innovation, I actually thought through that yesterday. I was on a big workshop with one of the big techs, with the global techs, with a team internally and the external team, obviously. And we were supposed to run an ideation session through Teams, right? A big component into innovation would be tacit, and you kind of just miss that totally out when you run that through whatever technology. So I kind of sat through that session yesterday, listening to the ideation process, and then doing my part, contributing. But then again, to me, there's a real big missing part to it, right? So yes, a crisis breeds innovation, but then again, doing it remotely from home is not necessarily sustainable to me. It's tough.
Torger?
And that goes back to some of the areas where I've been doing research, because we thought that digitalization would really make things, everybody could work remote. And then Michael Porter comes back and said, in that situation, actually the effects become local. I mean, the trust factor, the closeness relationship, and so on. So even though we can work globally through this new technology, we still need the close things, because that is a trust factor, and I think that is still important. And that's why I think you could ask us what will happen to universities. I mean, you can't move everybody out of university. They need to be there. That's where the trust relationships are to being developed. I think here the Nordic region have a good advantage.
Yeah, and also in terms of building networks, meeting friends, potential spouses, all these things that happened beyond simply learning something. As you said before we came on earlier today, Torger, you can do that anywhere, but there's so much more to an education and being part of being a student of a business school or a new employee in BDO that you would not get simply through this digitized media, right?
Yep.
So how are you planning now to onboard new employees? Or do you have anyone who was as fortunate as being hired and started on March 10th, by the way?
No, I don't. I don't think anyone started March 10th. But well, onboarding is it's a huge thing in terms of training your people, in terms of building a culture, in terms of kind of socializing and get people to feel welcome, right? A lot of firms invest a tremendous amount of money into onboarding processes and so on and so forth. Will they change? Yes, they will probably change a bit, because you will do more training digitally, you will kind of use more digital tools and so on. But still, the important component into you know, onboarding your people in a good way would be to give them a sense of what it means to work for this and that company as well, right? So and basically to build relations, to build you know, a safe environment to work in themselves. So yes, it will change to some sense, but I think a lot of the important components in terms of building the right culture for the future will still be around, which means we need to meet in person and spend time together as well, right?
There's a lot of questions pouring in. We're really thankful for that. We have to actually start to summarize a bit now with one big question that then I will ask Trond Morten to respond to, and then Torger, and then we'll end with the more cynical approach of Espen. And the big question is, how do you see the future of globalization? And let's start with you, Trond Morten.
Yeah, and I don't think globalization will stop, right? So I think we will still have a global economy. I still think globalization kind of will work its way through. It's a big thing to kind of rethink. We touched on supply chains and so on earlier on. So to rethink your business model, to rethink your supply chains would be incredibly important. I do not think we will jump into a deglobalization, to put it that way. I think it might be a reglobalization, but I think we will still live in a global economy going forward. Yeah.
Okay, thank you, Torger.
But I think globalization will take a different form. It has, because simply having full division of labor, everything being done in different countries, I think that will create too much risks. So I think we should look for new business models where you combine the positive effects of globalization that we strongly believe in, with also being able to source locally, have other type of areas, maybe sustainable things that work locally, because otherwise we will get the same problems next time we get a pandemic. And this is not the first time. There will be more crises like this. So I think we should think in terms of finding new business models, and I think that will be a big move, and it's a big opportunity for business schools, because this is what we're good at.
Espen?
I'm sorry for disappointing you, but I'm more going to say that.
That's your role.
Exactly. Not playing my role here, but no. But I generally agree with the other guys in the sense that I think those guys who are saying that globalization is dead or this is like the rebirth of nationalism are generally wrong. We have learned something. We have learned something that things were more fragile than we believed, or at least, or there were risks that we didn't take into account. So we have to make all systems more robust, meaning supply chains, being, for example, how we are thinking about hospital capacity in a lot of different areas. But that doesn't mean that we are going to totally change the model in any way, shape, or form.
Thank you, gentlemen, for adding to this discussion. We are nearing the end. I would just like to emphasize for you that there's going to be a next webinar in the fall, which we hope that a lot of you will follow. And since we are also committed to sustainable developmental goals at BI, we will then ensure that the next webinar will have a more balanced approach when it comes to gender composition. It has been overwhelmingly male discussions today, but we will ensure that we will be more balanced in future occasions. So with that, I would just like to really thank Trond Morten for accepting our invitation to come here, and I would like to thank my esteemed colleagues for being both, well, realistic, optimistic, and cynical when it comes to the future and how to develop our business, and we wish you all the best. Take care and stay safe.